Hello and welcome to Western Civ. In this bonus author interview, I sit down with historian Adam Smyth and talk about his most recent book, aptly titled The Bookmakers, A History of the Book in 18 Lives. We've done a couple of different author interviews on this podcast already, talking about the history of book production and literature in general. A little bit on the library, the book at war, you'll remember some of those episodes. This one's a little bit different because it goes beyond mere authorship on the impact on the book on society. It really gets to the development of printing and printing from different angles. And that's what makes the book very unique, as I think the interview is about to show you. As always, the book is available today. So if you're listening to it and you'd like to pick up a copy, feel free to click the link in the show notes and it'll take you right to the page where you can purchase it. That being said, let's get on to the interview. Okay, welcome back. As I mentioned moments ago, sitting down with historian Adam Smyth, we're going to be talking about The Bookmakers, a history of the book in 18 lives. And, for listeners of the show, they'll kind of remember, we've done a couple of books in the relative recent history. We've done a history of the library, we've done the book at war, we've done a whole bunch of different of these. So I actually kind of wanted to start out with a very general question before we dig into the meat of the book, which is, what was the inspiration for this book? And it is important that it focuses on 18 different people who are influential in the history and development of printing in the book in different ways. And so I'm just kind of curious as to what put that idea in your brain, because it is a little bit unique.
Great. Well, thanks very much for having me on. I'm really pleased to be here chatting to you. Well, the inspiration really came from my own engagement with bookmaking and printing. So I teach literature and books and history at Oxford University. And I particularly work with early modern books, 16th, 17th, 18th century books, others too, but often those. And at a certain point, I realized to understand those books and how they work, I needed to know how they were made. So with a couple of friends, I bought a mid-19th century letterpress, big, heavy object about the size of your old laser printer you have in your offices somewhere. Took it home and put it in a little barn next to our house and started to learn to produce books the old-fashioned way, letterpress, which means the tiny metal letters, putting them in a composing stick, pulling the printing press to produce copies that way. And it's a really slow, physical, error-prone, meditative process that I really enjoyed. And it made me think about who made books. We used to talking about authors, of course, but I was interested in that kind of little community that brought books into being: the printers, the publishers, the proofreaders, the correctors, the librarians, the sellers, the whole kind of society that isn't registered always, particularly in early printed books. So the book set out to try and bring those figures to life and to prominence, really, and to think about their role in the history of the books as a kind of counter to the kind of heroic author figures that we're always talking about and discussing. And that was one inspiration. The other inspiration was I wanted to draw up a different roll call of bookmakers. So this is a book that has 18 lives, and they're not generally the names that you might think. So the more familiar names like Gutenberg, for example, or in England, William Caxton or Virginia Woolf, perhaps, these kind of names, these kind of luminaries, they're in the book, but they're slightly decentered. They're in the kind of room next door. And I've tried to recenter figures who were crucial but have somehow fallen out of the limelight. So rather than Virginia Woolf, say, Nancy Cunard, and rather than William Caxton, his former apprentice Wynkyn de Worde. And by doing that process of shifting our gaze a little bit, I was trying to tell a slightly different kind of story, construct a slightly different genealogy of where the book came from and what these bookmakers did.
Well, I found it very refreshing that for once we had a story, and it's a narrative, of course, about bookmaking and a history about bookmaking that didn't totally focus on Gutenberg, or at least make that its kind of central focus. Because I think listeners to the show and casual history buffs will know that name. They'll know Gutenberg, and when they think printing, that's who they think of. And rightly so, to a large extent. But it is important to recognize that there were a lot of other figures who were just as influential, maybe not just influential, but influential in their own ways. And I want to start with the name that you just brought up, which is the first of the 18 lives that you talk about in the book, which is Vinken de Burder. And that's a tough name. But I think he's a really interesting guy, because if you could tell us who he was, and also you write in the book how he understood what today, I suppose, we would call consumer demand. And what was that? How did he come to those conclusions? Like, he's an interesting figure early on.
Yeah, he's a fascinating figure. He's a former apprentice of Caxton. He's a Dutchman working with Caxton abroad in Northern Europe in the late 15th century, in Cologne, maybe in Bruges and Ghent, and then comes back to London with Caxton and serves him, and seems to be devoted to his master. And when he starts to print on his own, De Word uses as his emblem Caxton's old emblem with the W and the C to denote his own books. He's a smart and savvy entrepreneur. Caxton was a rather more courtly figure, printed courtly books for often aristocratic readers. De Worde was interested in the readers he might never meet, but whose demands and desires he had a capacity to sense. He was an early, crucial figure in constructing the idea of the English language bestseller, printing cheap, mobile, available titles, some of them learned and showing the influence of kind of humanist learning, for example, and classical culture, but lots of them for what we would call the general reader. Grammar guides, religious works, books of history. He's a great printer if you feel there's some learning out there. If you feel there's some learning out that you never quite got round to acquiring, he produces lovely editions of Cicero with the Latin on one side and the English in the other. Lots of works of popular culture, joke books, ballads, romances, and also what we would call today, but wasn't called then, literature. So he prints Chaucer and Stephen Hawes and John Skelton and continental romances too. And he's a bit of a genius at diverting what had been hits in manuscript culture, so handwritten culture of the 15th century, and converting those into cheap, mass-produced, printed books. He does that, for example, with the great 1499 edition of Sir John Mandeville's Travels that he prints. Mandeville's Travels is a somewhat fantastical account of travelling from St. Albans near London through Constantinople, Jerusalem to China. Notionally a report of actual journeys, but probably the product of fantasy and imagination. And that had been a really massive hit in manuscript. And De Worde realised that that's a route he wants to pursue in his own printing. And so offers a printed version of that with beautiful images too. Actually, beautiful images is the wrong term. Compelling, quick, attractive, clickbaity images. That's what he's an expert in. So he's crucial in establishing the idea of the widely read, easily purchasable, cheap printed book in English at a time when that was still a novelty. And he's working in Fleet Street, which becomes a crucial centre for newspapers and for print in the centuries that follow. And he's a crucial early figure in that. So he's eclipsed by Caxton's name and by Gutenberg's name, but he's absolutely central for really realizing, I think, for the first time, the truly democratizing potential of print, the capacity of print to take work which had been handwritten or very expensive, or texts which circulated in little coteries around the court or universities, taking that capacity of print to disseminate quickly, widely, identical copies of those works out to newer readers. And he's really exciting and important for doing that.
Well, I wanted to ask a follow-up question on that. So, because when we think about sort of mass printing today, printing of books for, everyone to read, I don't know if I'm still thinking about that term in the right way when we're talking about the 16th century. Were literacy rates high enough to sustain sort of a mass printing industry at this point? Was De Verde still predominantly having to sell his works to the gentry, to a large extent to the upper mercantile classes? And then, when we talk about like the price of books, were these things that someone who, maybe they're not a laborer, okay, but maybe they're an apprentice in a shop or something like that, are these the things that those individuals might have been able to afford at this point? Or are we still talking about something that is really more geared towards the elite?
Well, it's in transition, I think. Literacy rates are rising, particularly in London. Books are sometimes expensive, but need not be expensive. Sometimes can be purchased for a couple of pence. And De Worde is absolutely looking for the middling sort, I guess you would say. Aspiring prentices, the people who filled the streets around his Fleet Street residence. If we could drop by St. Paul's Churchyard, which is just a few hundred yards from where De Worde was on Fleet Street, St. Paul's Churchyard, that is a cathedral around St. Paul's, that is the land around St. Paul's Cathedral in central London. This was the book selling hub of London. Stalls, open stalls, kind of market stalls set out around the churchyard with booksellers offering their wares. And that was a truly open, accessible outdoor space in a really busy, teeming part of London. And if we could travel back in time, I think we would see a real range of people there, and absolutely print becoming not an elite preserve, but something available for men and women of all kind of social classes. And in fact, De Worde's really interested in women readers in a way that's really novel and important.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that. I thought that part was interesting in the book. I just don't think of women readers as starting to become a focus for booksellers until I really don't think until really the 19th century, but clearly I'm not correct when I think that. And so was this something that De Verde saw and thought, well, this is a potential marketplace that isn't being tapped? Or was this something that was driven by more of a demand side immediate need, that these readers were already there and they wanted books that they could read? And I'm talking about specifically about female audiences.
Yeah, I mean, I think De Worde's relationship with women and women readers is really interesting and complicated, but it's clearly a refrain in his career and his output. Some of those connections are aristocratic, we should say. I mean, he works very closely with Lady Margaret Beaufort, who's the mother of Henry VII, crucial royal figure, key in overthrowing Richard III. And she loves books. She was pious, and she commissioned sermons and religious guides, religious books from a number of printers, including De Worde, and paid him and commissioned him and supported him. She's responsible for this astonishingly compelling book called The Ship of Fools, which is still somewhat known today, an account of folly and foolishness, which is really hilarious and hilariously illustrated. So De Worde works closely with her, and on that aristocratic level has a strong female patron and supporter. But if we drop down the social hierarchy, he's doing it too. And partly that comes from his religious publications. Lots of them imagine female readers. I guess the most compelling example of that is the version of the book of Marjorie Kemp that he produces. Now, Marjorie Kemp is still quite well known today, or actually recently in the last 10 years has become really well known within late medieval studies. Marjorie Kemp from 14th century Norfolk, a remarkable woman who travels to Jerusalem, becomes a religious hermit, an anchorite, and writes, or at least dictates to a scribe, the book we tend to now call the first autobiography in English. So this is 14th century Norfolk. Marjorie Kemp produces an account of her life. It's weirder and more interesting than the term autobiography implies, I think, but it's definitely an account of much of what she did in her life, her sense of herself and her subjectivity through a pious lens. Now, the word is interested in that text, and he produces, in a rather characteristically streetwise way, a short and kind of redacted kind of handbook version of that. 7 pages long, a first-person dialogue between a voice that once was Kemp's and a voice that seems to be Christ's, and a kind of back and forth about how a woman, and in particular a woman feeling hardship and adversity, both spiritually and materially, how she should behave. So it's a guide for dealing with struggles and adversity from an absolutely centered female perspective. Again, popular and well-known and read in manuscript. The word sees the capacity, the potential of print to get that text, or a version, a kind of redacted, shortened version of that text, out to lots of readers. And it's absolutely about female experience, and it's absolutely intended for female readers. So that's a second example. I guess the third example of him thinking about women readers is stranger, weirder, even more compelling, I think. And it's a text that normally is called a birth girdle. That is, it's a strip of text with print on it that is to be laid across a woman's womb during labor to act as a kind of prayer or aid to a healthy birth. And we know that this practice of birth girdles during labor, we have examples of manuscript cases, that is handwritten cases for an elite, even courtly world. This text is super compelling because it seems to be a cheap printed version of that formerly elite practice. It only survives because the text itself, the printed text by de Worde, was subsequently used as waste, as binding waste. That is, was used by a binder as waste paper, essentially, to pad out the binding of a later book. And so, accidentally, as it were, this amazing birth girdle text survived, carried along in this other book, and then at a certain point in the recent past, librarians realized actually this is very interesting, and they extricated that waste, as it was, from the book, and we have this printed birth girdle that survives. So in other words, he's doing very different things with female readers, but the thread that runs through those three examples is him thinking about how print can reach women in new ways, and how books can speak to women's lives in ways that they hadn't before, I think.
That just makes me think of all the pieces of literature that have survived throughout the centuries by accident. And of course, all those that we don't have that are mentioned by other texts and that we could only dream of someday. I still hope that maybe somewhere there's a box deep in, I don't know, the Vatican or something that has a lot of these old texts that we haven't seen yet. But I wanted to ask a question about the physicality of book printing, because I don't think I enjoyed this section of the book, and I don't know that many readers or listeners really understand the nature of what a print shop would have looked like in the early 16th century. So when we picture this enterprise, what should we be thinking about? Like, what would we experience if we, let's say, walked into the front door of a print shop?
Well, I mean, that's a great question, I think, and I think we know a little bit about de Worde's print shop. We know where it was, on 130 Fleet Street, which is now a fast food restaurant. And we have some inventories from legal cases relating to other print shops around that time, which, for legal reasons, recorded all the stuff that was going on inside. And so we can paint a picture a little bit from those. De Werde's shop had been an inn called the Falcon, and he rented it from an abbey in Buckinghamshire. He lived there and he worked there, and that was how that was the norm. He probably had about 2 or 3 printing presses. It would have been cramped and in the winter very, very cold. The windows would have been lined with paper rather than glass as a kind of cheap way to keep the elements away from the pages. It would have been noisy. There would have been stacks of paper in one room. There would have been another space for composition, that is, for the process of aligning the little letters in a composing stick and then placing them in a form to create these metal pages. It would have been noisy, and it would have really smelt bad, I think, both the kind of labor and the sweat of that, but also the fact that the inking balls, which are these balls with handles which were used to apply ink to the type, were sat in buckets of urine overnight to keep them soft. So it would have been noisy, cold in winter, hot in summer. It would have smelt bad. The apprentice would have brought tankards of ale from the back regularly, so the place would have smelt of beer too. And I think there would have been a sense of busyness and deadline and a kind of excited stress. I mean, De Werde worked really fast. He produced an awful lot of titles, something like 800 editions, and it's before 1550. His output accounts for about 15% of all editions from that period. So he's hugely productive, and I think around him would have been this excited but intense and stressful sense of productivity, of deadlines. We know that printers seem to often have worked on multiple print jobs at the same time, so who maybe had several jobs going at the same time. The sheets that were pulled off the press, still wet, would have hung like washing on a line that spread out across the room above their heads. There would have been a sense of controlled chaos, I think. But also a really exciting sense of the relative novelty of all this. When we think of printing now, at least in terms of letterpress printing, it's a historic practice with a long and interesting historical tradition. De Werde is working around in the 1490s, at the very beginning of the 16th century. This is new. This is a new technology. This is a new media moment. There isn't much of a precedent for what he's doing, at least certainly in terms of the rate and the volume of output he's striving for. So there would have been the sense of being in a new moment and being in a new stage of media history. Not that that's a term he would have used, but it's a concept he would have understood. And I think there would have been a kind of thrill to that as well.
It kind of reminds me a little bit of maybe what you might have experienced in Silicon Valley early on with like a .com startup scenario where everybody's excited about something that's totally new and different. Well, let me move on to the next person, because the next one is interesting. It's Benjamin Franklin. I saw the name on there and I just kind of immediately thought, well, I'm going to turn to this chapter and kind of see what this one is about. Because, I think of a lot of things when I think of Benjamin Franklin, and certainly I know that he's involved in the sort of cheap print and the Poor Richard Almanac situation. But I guess I didn't think of him as sort of being a major contributor to the history of printing. So why is Franklin included in this book, and what does he do that makes him a significant figure?
Franklin's an amazing figure, obviously, for all kinds of reasons, as your listeners know at least as well as I do, as American listeners perhaps primarily. But Franklin is, before he becomes the political and scientific figure that we generally think of him today, worked as a printer and grew up as a printer's apprentice, working for his brother, spent some time early on in London, at the print shop of Samuel Palmer, where he was this extraordinarily proactive, dynamic, interested, driven printing apprentice who quickly became, despite his lack of formal schooling, learned and expert in the ways of printing and of print technology. But he's really, really fascinating to me because he's a pioneer in print culture, but he's not really a great book printer. In other words, he's interested in other kinds of printing. He's particularly interested in cheap print, in what print historians call jobbing printing, which means things like indulgences or cheap almanacs or what we would call flyers or playbills or advertisements or certificates or licenses or lottery tickets or newspapers or book plates or soap wrappers, that kind of stuff. The stuff that that still surrounds us today as we look around the street or our house or our office. This is what Franklin did. I mean, he did produce significant books like an edition of Samuel Richardson's Pamela, for example, which is interesting and remarkable as a printed object. But his real talent and genius was for seeing print's capacity to quickly produce cheap non-book stuff. And we see that across the history of print, actually. I mean, the first bestseller, we might say, in the 15th century in print by Gutenberg was the Indulgence. That is the little single-leaf sheet, a bit like a blank checkbook, or a blank check, used to fill out notes of your sin to take to Catholic confession, for which you paid a little bit to the Catholic Church. It was this great money spinner. But thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands of these little single sheets were printed in the early years of print by Gutenberg, alongside the magnificent folio Bible that still survives today. Most of these indulgences fall to the ground, are trodden into the mud and are never seen again, but a tiny few survive. So Franklin is sustaining that interest in print and the non-book object, particularly in terms of almanacs, which is what he's really known for, and also newspapers. He's a monumental figure in the history of print culture, but the objects he produced were not themselves monumental. They were slight, and they were mobile, and they were fast, and they were cheap, and they were popular in all senses. But that's what he built his reputation on. And I think the history of the book, as a discipline, as a kind of intellectual inquiry, has, for understandable and very reasonable reasons, often organised itself around monumental titles, monumental books. Last year was the 400th year anniversary of Shakespeare's First Folio, of course, printed in 1623, which is this, as you guys know, is this big gathering of Shakespeare's 36 plays. It's a monumental, big, large object, physically imposing. And that's the kind of coordinate that book history has tended to focus on, to tell a story about what print is and why books matter and what books are. There's a whole other fascinating counter-narrative, which is what Franklin's invested in, which is cheapness, slightness, mobility, speed. And I think that's one refrain running throughout all the chapters of my book. And from De Werder, really, through Benjamin Franklin, and then culminating in the last chapter, which is about zines and do-it-yourself books and risograph and the photocopying machine or the Xerox machine in 21st century England and America too.
Well, that's interesting. And I want to come back to this idea of Franklin and cheap print, because then you bring up this idea that's in the book called jobbing, which I thought was interesting. And I thought maybe you could explain what that was and how Franklin played a role in that, because I thought that was kind of an interesting idea.
Yeah, well, it's Franklin working on cheap, slight publications, often alongside the edition of Cicero he's producing or the edition of Pamela that he's producing, and often stopping those larger jobs, those larger printing works, to produce quickly a sudden, immediate requirement for some cheap item. Someone comes in needing thousands of lottery tickets. He produces his almanac, his slight little diary prognostication, his almanac, for example, or the licenses and certificates and warrants that I was talking about earlier. So Franklin works on these all the time, and they interrupt the larger, more monumental kind of printing that he produces. The almanac, I guess, is the most well-known iteration of this that Franklin takes part in. He has a series of almanacs called Poor Richard. Almanacs are, and they still exist today, don't they? There's some combination of desk diary, predictive work that will tell you what to do for the year ahead, and a kind of calendar. They're cheap, they're small, they're portable, they're monthly calendars, they're astrological and meteorological prognostications. They have lots of useful information, journey distances, maps, lists of fairs, medical advice, little potted works of history. They were massively popular in England in the 17th century. They were the best-selling kind of book in England in the 17th century. And so in the 18th, Franklin is noticing that, as he would, as anyone would, and starting up his own, as typically he would do. And the first edition of Poor Richard comes out, printed in 1732, comes out in 1733, and is cheap, 5 pence a copy or so, and is immediately massively popular. The first edition sells something like 10,000, and this is in a colony with a population in the 1730s of less than 15,000. So it's almost the case that everyone has their copy of Poor Richard. So it's very, very Franklin-like. It's cheap. It's quickly made. It's well written, given the form. It's deeply, deeply popular, and it has a kind of loosely Christian, practical sense of virtue. A particular Franklinian combination of kind of reason, progressiveness, morality, and an absolute ideological buy-in to thrift and trade and profit. They're deeply ideological texts for those reasons, even though they seem to come at us as light, merely practical works. And as he was producing these almanacs with all this practical information, Franklin would add in these little proverbial couplets and rhymes and stanzas, which would advocate the virtues of industry and thrift and labor and saving and moderation, which became crucial ideas in the formation of the kind of society he thought was important. So they're both individually slight. If you were to read one now in a library, they would seem like little publications, but they were vastly popular and disseminated that kind of practical Christian profit-seeking trade ideology in really important ways.
Today, as school children in the United States, you still do get the little sayings from Poor Richards. That those are typically still in the textbook. When you pick it up, you'll see, Benjamin Franklin's associated with invention and a couple of other things, and then he wrote these almanacs, and here's a couple of sayings from them. But they actually are really interesting. If you ever, anyone who's listening, if you ever have a chance to pick one up and look at an original one, I think, as you were just mentioning, you'd be a little bit surprised at some of the ideological depth that some of these texts actually have. Let me ask you a little bit then about another individual, and that's John Baskerville, and his association with topography. That I thought was, or typography, that I thought was really interesting, because I just think we take it for granted today, and we absolutely shouldn't. And so kind of what was this field like when he was starting out, and how did Baskerville start to, I don't want to say unify it. But how did he start to change typography in a way that made it a little bit more standardized?
Yeah. Well, so Baskerville's, he's a really interesting figure. So John Baskerville, he's mid 18th century in Birmingham in England. He comes to printing and typography pretty late. As many of these figures did, actually. Printing is often something one turns to, it seems, after having done something else loosely related to books and writing and creativity or making. His background was in he taught calligraphy. He was a writing master, so he was interested in letter forms, and he taught them to young men and women in Birmingham. He was also interested in japanning, that is the covering of metal goods in a kind of ornamental black or tortoiseshell covering to make them look a little bit like the kind of objects that were being imported by the East Indian Company at this point. So he had a kind of technical, business savvy background, but also an interest in letters. And he began printing in the 1750s. And he produced, very unlike Franklin and very unlike de Worde, he produced big, deeply canonical books. The Bible, Paradise Lost, works of classical culture. He thought a book should be immaculately produced and printed, should be expensive, or was necessarily expensive, and should be expressing a text which culture had already kind of bought into and valued. But it's probably most important in terms of typography, as you say, that is that the question of letter form and the design of particular letters and typography in England at this point, and this goes for America at the same point, where Franklin is working around about the same time as Baskerville, and they knew each other and met each other actually in England, and Franklin bought some of Baskerville's books and asked him about the printing process. Type at this point is a little bit rudimentary. Most English printers imported letters from Dutch foundries. There wasn't much of a English tradition at this point. There was a foundry run by Samuel and William Caslon, but really Baskerville broke new ground with his work on letter forms, and he designed a new type which became known as Baskerville, and which still exists on your word processor today. And in fact, to my delight, my book is actually printed in Baskerville type as a kind of quiet homage to Baskerville's work. His letters are subtly but profoundly distinct from what went before, clear and calmer. He heightened the contrast between the thin and thicker strokes of the letter. His letters were more slender and more upright. The curved strokes became smoother and more circular. His serifs grew more horizontal and sharper and tapered. And really, you see all of this sophistication and clarity in two famous letter forms that he has. Now, his most famous letter, his signature letter, is his uppercase Q. And if you can look online at Baskerville's 18th century uppercase Q, it sounds slight, but it's a work of art. It's a work of beauty, and his typographical signature. And it has a tail, the tail at the bottom of the Q, which curls out extravagantly beyond the body of the letter. And its thickness widens and then narrows as it proceeds like a ribbon that's blowing in the wind. It's really beautiful. That's his uppercase Q. And also his lowercase G is really, really lovely, with the ear that hangs off to the right of the G at the top right, and then the bowl of the bottom half of the G opening out, really recalling, I think, the handwritten calligraphy that he cared about so much. Typography's often a kind of invisible art, I think. I mean, the point of type, many people would suggest, I think, is to is to be discreet and to be kind of invisible in the sense that it shouldn't confuse or interfere with what it is trying to convey, which is the text by the author. So great type, rather paradoxically, should be unnoticed. There's a wonderful mid-20th century writer about typography called Beatrice Ward, who I urge everyone to read and find out about. She's a fascinating figure. And she has a famous analogy where type is like a crystal goblet, like a wine glass. And it should convey the text, that is the wine, but not obscure it or interfere with it or distract from it. I think Baskerville's genius in his typographical design was to get that exactly right and to produce the kind of minor miracle of designing a typeface which is both beautiful but also hard to notice, that quickly becomes natural and highly fluent for the eye. And I think that kind of flickering between presence and absence that we feel when we read Baskerville's writing also kind of stands for him as a historical figure. He's kind of there. We know a little bit about him, but he's also behind his books. He brings these books into being, but he himself is not really the story, or at least he didn't want himself to be the story. So yeah, I think he's interesting in all kinds of reasons, but in terms of typographical design and a commitment to a certain kind of font that we still use today, he's still with us. And the other thing I should add to all that is that he's crucially aided by his wife, Sarah Eves, who is far, far less well known and not normally part of that history at all, but is a crucial figure in aiding his early business years and helping him become a profitable businessman, but also actually in the process of printing. And after he died, she carries on printing for a while, produces 2 editions of her own. So I think Baskerville's a crucial name for typography and constructing a newly clear English typographical aesthetic, which is still with us. But Sarah Eves, his wife, is a big part of that story too.
Well, and it's interesting, I was sort of taken by the book when I was reading it, and I didn't realize that the font was done in Baskerville. And now as I'm holding the book in front of me, looking at it here, and I'm recognizing some of the things that you're pointing out. And there is a certain elegance to it. But I think like anytime, especially a student goes and they pick up a book from, let's say, even the 18th century, certainly the 16th, or certainly the 17th century, it is hard because all of the fonts tend to be a little bit different, and they can obscure in some way the text, especially if some of those old texts, you get block letters that are very close together, and it can be really challenging for someone to read. So you can kind of understand why an innovation like this, subtle as it may be, is very, very important for the overall readership, because it makes the text more accessible to more people later on. And the other thing I wanted to ask about Baskerville here really quickly was he has this unique ink recipe. And ink is something that you don't think about when you think about the history of printing. You don't think about, well, how are you getting the text onto the page? And the answer is ink. And you might think, well, everyone was using the same ink. Well, that's not true. And so I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about his recipe, because I was taken a little bit aback by it because I thought it was interesting, and explain kind of why it mattered.
Yeah. So Baskerville did lots of individually quite small and precise things to the process of book production, which accumulatively produced these miraculously beautiful, calm objects. And it's interesting you were saying then just how clear and accessible the Baskerville font becomes, particularly in contrast to what went before. And I totally agree. If you look at a kind of black letter, 16th century or 17th century books, they're super dense. Even when they're well inked and not over inked, as they often were, they're difficult for us to read, and they seem to stand between the reader and the text rather than enabling that interaction. Baskerville's books are correctives to that process, and they have a wonderful sense of space and calm and openness about them. And part of that was his developments with ink, and he. The central ingredient of ink is soot, is lampblack or soot, and he seemed to have mixed soot that he got from his experience from metalwork and from soldering and from using lamps late into the night. He experimented with that particular quality of soot and mixed it into his ink, and the result seems to be that his ink shone, and you can definitely see that. Even you call up these Baskerville books in the New York Public Library or the Bodleian Library or the British Library or wherever you are reading, and you can see the ink has this miraculous kind of shine to it. His ink also seems to have dried really quickly, which meant that the reverse side of the sheet could be perfected, which means printed as a second part really, really quickly. So he seems to have drawn on his experience with metalwork and japanning, covering all those tea trays and metal objects with this kind of black coating, as he did in the earlier 18th century, and then using that knowledge to produce this ink. And so alongside these advances in ink, he also had these technological innovations like hot pressing the paper, which is a technique he never really explained and is still shrouded in secrecy, but it seems to have been to do with after printing, pressing the paper between hot plates, which seem to have given it a kind of shine, a kind of a burnished quality. And he also altered the mechanical workings of the press itself, and was particularly adept at producing the particular quality of dwell. That is, when you pull the press and the paper and the metal letters touch each other, that moment of slight squeeze, if that's too much, then the page gets over-inked and even embossed and the letters become unclear. Too little pressure and the ink doesn't carry. He worked a lot on that moment. The lovely term is dwell, of when the letters and the paper touch. That kiss. He altered the press a lot to ensure that the pressure was precisely right. And if you look at these Baskerville books today, they have an ink that shines and is perfectly distributed across the surface of the page. Well, in pursuit, as we've been saying, of a kind of super clarity that is easy to miss precisely because it's clarity, but is this incredible achievement, I think, in the history of printing.
You just don't think about all of these things, and I think that that's one of the things that's just very valuable about reading this book. Is you start to think about the importance of the machine. You start to think about the real craftsmanship that was involved earlier in the production of books. Today, we think of things that are sort of mass produced by one of the large publishers, and they're just kind of printed off because what you care about is the story. But pick up an old book sometime and you realize like it's just as much a piece of art as it is a piece of literature in so many ways, and so many different things went into the composition of that book. Well, we're coming up to time here, but I always like to end by saying, obviously, there's a tremendous amount. We only talked about briefly 3 of the 18 lives that are involved here. And so clearly there's a lot more in the book. But is there anything that you really want the listeners to know? Any particular story that you think is valuable? Anything else that we didn't have time to get to?
Well, I guess, thank you. That's an interesting final question. I think the final emphasis I would stress is that although this is a chronologically organized history, it begins with Wynkyn de Worde, who dies 1534 or 1535, and it ends with Yusuf Hassan, who produces zines and DIY text right now in New York City for Black Mass Publishing, and it travels at different points in between those. But the history of the book isn't a linear story of improvement of the book in any straightforward way, getting better through time. And one of the refrains of the book, I think, that I wanted to draw out was the kind of looping temporality of the book, the way in which, for example, books that were printed in the early 20th century by people like William Morris of the arts and craft movement, or his follower, Thomas Cobden Sanderson. They were making beautiful printed books in the late 19th, early 20th century, but they were making them to look like late medieval manuscripts or very, very early printed books. And they were interested in that kind of temporal flickering, partly because they were critics of mechanization and industrialization. And when we look at super contemporary zines, which are really having a moment in the UK and in North America right now, they are produced on risograph or Xerox or photocopying machines. They're cheaply bound. They're stitched with a thread and a needle. They're handed out, or they're at least very cheap. They have a kind of defiantly DIY materiality. They look in many ways like very, very early, late 16th century printed play pamphlets, for example. Before Shakespeare's First Folio, if you wanted to read a play, you would buy a printed playbook, a quarto book, which would be cheap, probably not bound, not terribly long, not terribly well printed, almost an ephemeral kind of printed object. But that's how you might encounter for the first time Hamlet or Romeo and Juliet or any of these other early modern plays. So I was really, really interested in the way in which the book exist at different historical moments at the same time. And those early 20th century books that look like late medieval books but were printed in the 1910s seem to resist a commonsensical kind of historicity. They don't simply supersede the books that went before, but they kind of hark back to them in really, really interesting ways. And that's that power that the book has in relation to time, I'm really interested in, and I hope I draw that out in this book, The Bookmakers.
Well, certainly, and I think that if there's ever sort of a common theme in the program and in all the interviews that I do, it's that history isn't necessarily linear. There are times when we cycle back for a variety of reasons, and this is just another reminder of how that works. But it's a terrific book. If you're listening to this, it's available right now. You can click the link in the show notes and you can have a copy delivered to you in no time at all, because printing has come quite a ways since the beginning. We don't have to wait for someone to warm up the printing press. But thank you so much for coming on the show. It's been just a great conversation.